Hey amigos, this is Matthew Human, and welcome to our first ever La Vida Verde podcast. My guest today is my landmate, amazing Sarah Wu, and we're going to be talking about living in community and different types of communities. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, welcome everybody to the Vida Verde podcast. This is our very first episode. I'm your host, Matthew Human, here at Finca Vida Verde, and my very first guest ever is the lovely Sarah Wu. Welcome, Sarah. Sarah is an herbalist, a permaculture teacher. She lives here in our community of Taquatal. She's lived in various other communities over the time, so it's an honor to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, for supporting Matthew Human and Finca La Vida Verde and La Vida Verde podcast. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about community. There's so much to say.
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
Okay. So I've known Sarah for about 15 years.
Yeah.
And about the same time I joined this community of Taquatal and founded Finca Vida Verde. It's about the time I met Sarah, and I met you at the time. You were engaged in a relationship with a friend of mine, and
another one of our land partners.
And another one
for many years, not in this one, but previously, yes.
Stephen Brooks, we love you, and so we kind of started off. You were kind of living. You started off. You were living down in La Ecovia, which is a sister community of Finca Vida Verde, and La Ecovia the project had started years before, but about 3 years later, people started living there, and you guys built a house.
Mm-hmm. Well, and before that, too, I was actually living in the community of Punta Mona.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a lot of different community experiences to be had.
Right.
in the experience here in Costa Rica. And
you want to talk a little bit about Punta Mona?
Sure,
your experience living there?
I think, too, with community, right? Before we even jump into that, we could kind of look at the different types of communities that are out there. And some of you watching and listening to this, you might be wondering, what is my community? And I remember the first time I heard about community was in university. And I had this teacher, we were doing a community arts program, and he said, "Who is your community?" And I remember at the time, I was like, I don't know. And I had to really think about it, and I felt so stupid and ashamed because my community at the time, I was like, okay, cat lovers and weed smokers. It was like, who's my community? I couldn't even really wrap my mind around that, because community for many of us, especially for those of you and us, we grew up in suburbs, in these systems, these designs that don't actually foster community. So it's really confusing, actually.
Or cities where people don't even know who lives next door to them.
Yeah, exactly. People don't know that. We're all together, but it's who are your neighbors? What do you really know? And who is your community? So I think one of the first questions, before we even get into some of these places, is ask yourself, who is my community, and what does community mean? Because community, it's there's lots of intersecting threads that help us to say, this is my community. So whether it's the language you speak, or the spiritual practice that you have, or for us, our thread is that we're both very dedicated to organic food is one. We know we can eat together. That comes up too for some people who have certain dietary belief systems. That's your community, the raw vegan community, for example, or a paleo community. Or some people, their community is their workout community. It's what they get together to do, and where they find,
where they intersect with each other.
Exactly,
right? So for us, that would probably be plants, structures. We're both really into kind of design and efficiency and permaculture. We're also both from upstate New York,
exactly.
So we have
we have a cultural community.
We have a cultural community.
And generational, right? Because we watch the same cartoons and listen to a lot of the same music, where it's that's where, again, we find our commonalities. And I think that's what's really important for us in community, because a lot of people, because community is so void of a lot of folks' lives, is that community for them becomes weird kind of patriotism, or senses of sports teams, and there's a sense of community within that, you know? So I
Yeah.
think that that's the first question.
I mean, for me, like community is more like just who really, because this is where this topic comes up a lot, because especially within Taquatal, like Finca Vida Verde is a part of a greater eco village called Taquatal, which again we've talked about before. It started 15 years ago, but we call that our community.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes I don't always feel like it is one of my communities. But for me, like I always think my community are the people I spend time with.
Mm-hmm.
So like you, for instance, I spend a lot of time with you. But like people, but also I spend time with the neighbors in La Covia and Alegria. So for me, my community is kind of greater than just that. So you have the Taquatal community, the Ecovia community, the Alegria. We have and then you have each individual's person's community.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, for
right,
me,
like I'm also in the herbalist community, which
Right.
is this big community, which I don't actually know everybody in it. You know what I
Right.
mean? But our connection is that we're practicing modern herbal medicine, and it's really broad. You know, like there can be different languages spoken and
Right.
stuff, but like what unites us is medicine plants and mushrooms,
Right.
and that's the thing that we're concerned and what we're very curious and excited by.
So that kind of so then going back to Punta Mona, because Punta Mona to me, it was a bit of a community. It was a community,
yeah.
but it was also like see I guess I define again it is community because it's people living together, sharing together, interacting on a daily basis. But for me, like I think that kind of word gets used around. It's like it's a very broad word
It is.
because that is a community. But when a lot of people talk about community today and they want community, I feel like they're talking about, especially when they talk about these kind of eco villages, they're actually talking about like community structures and whatnot, and like
Co-living, sharing resources.
exactly that, and for me, like. For me, one of those things that I think is very important is that everybody is that everybody has equal ownership. And that was one of the things about Punta Mona that like I've lived in a lot of situations like that, and it's kind of, it is a type of community. It's a different type of community.
It's a different model. Yeah, you know, because so for those of you who have maybe never heard about it, you can Google it, Punta Mona, and it was a farm. It still is a place. It's currently closed, but it was an educational retreat center, permaculture farm, and community. And the community structure there was really interesting because it was very family style,
Right.
I would say. And I lived there full time for 5 years. I was involved in it for I was involved in it for about 10 years, and in different aspects of, you know, from management to education to, you know, being in the community. And what I noticed is that it really took on like a very forest-like model, in that like the forest ecosystem, we look at it as a pattern, right? And we can see this in communities too, is that there's always a pattern present, is that there's someone who takes on a leadership role, there's someone who's kind of like that connector, there's someone who's kind of like the joker, there's someone who, you know, is really passionate about food, or someone who's like making sure that everyone's fed on time.
It's like the canopy tree,
The mycelium,
the bush, the mycelium.
rocks.
Yeah, I see. I get it.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. And I really love, actually, that's one of the things I philosophize internally about, which maybe one day I'll get down on paper, is, you know, because we look at like horizontal and pyramid and circular social structures. I'm really curious about the social structure as the forest. Anyways, so what I noticed at Punta Mona, while the humans were rotating quite frequently, people would be there from 2 weeks to a month to 6 months to 2 years. It was rare that someone would be there for more than 2 years. And in that, people fulfilled similar roles within the community, you know. And then there was
somebody would go and somebody would come and
they would
take over that role.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then there was the people like for instance, like it was owned, like the owners were it's what's known as a benevolent dictatorship, you would call it, a model where there's a single owner or a small group of owners, and then but the most of the people living there weren't actually owners. They were volunteers, they were guests, they were staff, but it still created that community because it was consistent and it was
they were
regular.
living together,
Right.
Yeah, and there was a level of empowerment that they had, but again, like you said, with that one single ownership, because that's what it was, is a one person owner, is that you know, the responsibility and the weight of
gets put on that person.
Put on that one person, where it's like it's really easy for the people who are like in management to make decisions and do these things, but then in the end of the day, like, who is fully responsible?
Right.
And so that was one of the biggest limitations I actually thought of that project, was that sense of ownership, and not just like economic ownership, but like that emotional feeling of like, this is my project, I'm in this, or we're in this together, right?
You mean by the guests, the people who are...
No, the people who are like the staff members or the community, because the guests were a different thing.
Right.
They were a much more temporary rotating.
I guess I always kind of thought as the volunteers as guests in a way too, but they were volunteers. They were longer term.
They were in it.
They were longer term. So you had these kind of owners that are like over, like they've been there since the beginning. I was actually a part of that community, but it was much more like...
You were the friend level.
I was the friend level, but I had been there for so long that it was like...
You felt ownership.
In a type of a social structure way, I was a little bit higher than the volunteers or the guests that lived there full time. When I would show up, people are like, "Who is this guy?" and like, "What's he doing?" And
yeah, exactly. And that was interesting there, right? But that was a very dynamic, unique place, right? Where you could really, because it was very remote, off the grid, in the jungle, like literally primary and secondary rainforest on the Caribbean. And so it took human beings. It was such an important part of my personal development, because it took me from thinking I was at the top of the world, or humans in this anthropocentric kind of a perspective, to really seeing like, okay, I'm somewhere in this evolutionary scale in between fungi and dolphins, and I'm trying to understand what we are here.
Right.
And so it was a really humbling experience.
Between fungi and dolphins.
Yeah, and it's like
we're humans between fungi and dolphins.
Somewhere in there, we're trying to find our way. Now, and I saw the limitations of that, and it was again really amazing, and it broadened so many people's, personal development again. And what was even really interesting too, and what I find now, is that the Puntamonian community is huge and global. And so like, I'll meet people that spent time there who I never actually lived with there.
Same.
And right away we feel camaraderie. We feel like family together, because we know.
Because it was such a deep place. I mean, it was like... you were deep out there in the jungle.
There was no masks, no hiding.
No.
You were straight up you.
Yeah. And sometimes naked you.
And
with each other.
Literally and metaphorically.
In the river and in the ocean. And yeah, it was a pretty special place. And also, it inspired a lot of different projects, because I know many people all over the planet, like, it inspired them, and now they've gone around and started places. I 100%, it was one of my major inspirations for Finca Vida Verde. In fact, we're even in a similar model. Like, when we talk about communities, like, Finca Vida Verde is also somewhat of a benevolent dictatorship in terms of the community structure. But there's a good side to that. The good side of that is no one likes the word dictatorship. I hate that word, honestly.
We call it a dictator.
Okay.
It's well, actually, if you want to break down benevolent dictator, it's Ben Elephant is his middle name, and then Dictator is a hyphenated last name.
Benevolent
Ben Elephant
Dictator. We're gonna remove him from the equation. We're gonna say it's a different structure. So it's an ownership model where it's owned by somebody, but the good thing about that is then the guests and the volunteers, they also had a lot less responsibility. They could show up and relax. Yeah. They didn't have to like being in community. When you as you're a homeowner, something goes wrong, there's no one to call. It's like you call yourself. It's like you call yourself out of the friggin' bed to like do the work. So there is something to be said for that that type of model. But then so going from that to and then you and me both, like, having come from that community down to, and you can watch it, by the way, if you're interested in Punta Mona, you can find all kinds of things online. Go watch Down to Earth with Zac Efron, episode 3, season 1, really, on Netflix. There's all kinds of great things you can watch. Steven's been doing media there for years. But then, now we've all kind of settled in this area, and this was actually a specific decision made by Steven, and we'll have him on the show sometime, and he can talk way more about this, but basically choosing this area because he had a criteria, like, we want to be, an hour from the airport, we want to be on a crystal clear river that you can drink the water, we want, what was else? Well, in a climate where you can grow year
Where you can
round.
grow a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in this area, it really was specifically chosen for that. And also, it was an area that before we got here, really, I mean, they called this part of Costa Rica, they called this part of San Mateo Desamparados. It's still called Desamparados de San Mateo, which is basically like kind of abandoned land. And it mostly was all, when we first got here, we were pretty much the first, like, kind of like non-locals in this area, and it was mostly just cows and forests, and unfortunately most of the forests had been cut down already for the cows and agriculture, but primarily at this point it's been mostly cows. So now what's been happening around here is we're kind of reclaiming these lands slowly, and people are starting to move here. So this comes down to like the concept of conservation versus stewardship, or you call regeneration. It's like humans aiding in. I personally am a big fan of stewardship. I know you are too, where the humans interacting with the earth and, you know, adding our compost, adding our poop, adding our, you know, and really taking care of the earth and mitigating the erosion and things like that, or actually adding you know, or actually helping to actually heal the biosystem around here. Like some people think of humans as like this horrible thing, but like, yeah, if humans had never been here, maybe it would have been a much better situation, but humans have been here for generations, and some of them not really using practices that were very beneficial.
Well, and I think what's important too, before we even move forward, is a part of the land acknowledgement of that, you know, we're many generations in right now of having displaced the original people from these lands.
Definitely.
And so the original people from these lands are the Wetar people. There's 7 or 8 geopolitical lines, of course, between like Costa Rica and Panama on how many tribes there are, but it's like 7 or 8 tribes here in Costa Rica. And so in this area we're in, like to kind of give you an idea of where we are, we're in low mountains outside of our central valley. We're at about 1,500 feet, or at about 600 meters-ish. In elevation, we're about 1 hour from the beach as humans drive. And so, you know, the Wetar people were the original people here. They were displaced many, many generations ago. So we're in a new wave of another form of colonization of these lands,
and then there was
right?
after the Wetar, it was the conquista, the Spanish,
exactly.
and
that's what I mean. So many a few different iterations of humans on
Spanish,
this
and
land.
then the Costa Rican, you know, people, and then now
and now there's this big influx of, you know, folks from countries outside of Latin America
all over the world
coming in. Yeah.
Oh, we had a party here the other night, and there was 23 people and 14 countries represented.
Yeah.
And these are just my friends. This wasn't like, you know, I didn't try and converge an international community. I literally just put an email or a WhatsApp message out to my closest friends in the community.
Well, that's what's so interesting too about Costa Rica, and we're creaking a little from the river of our conversation, but it's interesting.
Doesn't
that
matter.
Costa
We talk
Rica,
about whatever we want. This is my podcast, Sarah. This is the
Right.
Vida Verde podcast.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So in permaculture, we talk about the importance of edge, right? And edge is where, you know, the things are, you know, we use it like metaphorically. I'm on the edge, you know, I'm on the edge of a big, or on the verge of something. But edge is where evolution and adaptation takes place. So whether it's, and where we find the most species. We can look at this in ecosystems. It's called ecotones. It's where 2 ecosystems overlap, where we have the unique ecosystem in the middle, and that's what Central America is. So when we look at Central America, for example, which would be Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, Costa Rica, Panama. Did I say Nicaragua? Nicaragua. And here, so we're in this like land bridge which connects these 2 major continents. And so right there, we have this major increase of biodiversity. But what's interesting about this country in particular is that there's evidence of Mayan Empire interacting with the South American tribes, and also like empires and stuff, in Costa Rica being like the stopover point, you know, based on like archaeological evidence and plants and like those cultural things and stuff. And so we see like this huge biodiversity here that's always taken place in this intersection as well of humans, and which we're also seeing in our present day. Modern humans also intersecting here and coming in and finding so much biodiversity and love for nature as well as, different types of human connection taking place. And so I'm sure you've probably heard of Costa Rica in some way, and whether it's like through
Wait,
New
there's
Age.
people watching from outside Costa
There
Rica?
are.
You think they're watching?
I think
from
so.
outside
I
Costa
hope
Rica?
so. I hope so.
Okay.
And so, these folks who you've heard about Costa Rica, maybe it's about spiritual community, maybe it's about, medicine ceremony, maybe it's about organic farming, maybe you're coming here to bird watch or to watch animals, or you've heard about, the new green revolution taking place here, in our government policies and et cetera, which aren't always perfect. Every government has its problems, but I think overall, like looking in the global perspective, Costa Rica is doing a pretty badass job.
Yeah,
and
it's
I'm so proud of this country.
this tiny
I
little
love
country
it.
that
Yeah.
and amazing, but like in the 1950s they banned their military and like decided, you know what, we don't want to.
We're gonna protect every tree.
We're gonna protect trees, and we're gonna protect nature. We're gonna build our economy on preserving nature. Actually, that happened quite a bit later. Actually, that was like
into
actually
the 70s. And
yeah, that was like more of a later movement. But like banning the military and giving people health care and
yeah, it's a social democracy.
yeah, it's a social democracy. People have health care. There's education. It's like it's not pure communism or socialism. It's a mix of things, but it's like it's better than what some of us have. Coming from the U.S., for instance.
It's a mess.
Yeah, it's like where you have to like literally. If you have money, you can do stuff. If you don't, you're suck it up and you're poor and
you're
just
stuck
deal with
there.
it. It's like
So
then both of you and me. I know that both you and me kind of come from. We don't come from. Neither of us come from like large inheritances or anything. Both of our parents were working class families from upstate New York, which is another one of our connections, of course. But like that gives you a perspective. It's like and probably some of our I have many friends who are I would consider them wealthy. They would consider themselves wealthy, but they don't have always have that perspective of like they don't have the experience of being like in the lower class, and like even me being like maybe middle class. But because I was middle class, I've worked with a lot of really lower class people, like people that have really had a lot less than me, like working at like Burger King and stuff like that, like in my earliest iterations of humanity, like, it's that interaction with like people that are different than you to understand that like, wow, man, like, and it's kind of intentional, I think, that they keep like the separation of like,
That's very intentional.
yeah, like some. I mean, I don't know who's doing it or whatever, but it's working.
It's an economic model.
It's
when
an
we
economic
say who,
model,
there's
right.
not like one.
Right.
It's a collective. They are everybody. So, anyways, but like bringing it back to community, then, right? When we look here, for example, what we've got to experience here in this country is that we do see a wave. This is quite popular right now, is to come here to try to create communities,
Right.
to create farms, etc. And so there's a lot of different models, I think, is what we're talking about in the diversity even of perspectives on like what community is, how community should be created.
Sure.
And so, for example, Solas, it's a urban community in San Jose. I think it's in
Stolas.
Stolas, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Not Solas.
In San
Stolas,
Pedro.
in San Pedro, right, which friends of ours started, which is, they're buying up houses on a block to create urban community. So it's a form of co-living, right? And that's also what we think about is co-living, and what does that look like?
And that's really popular in like California and Berkeley. There's a lot of
sure.
co-living situations.
Well, and especially for those of you watching, I think a lot of us now are like these millennial and Gen Z and all this kind of stuff. And, what economists are saying is like very few of us will be able to ever own land or homes. And we're at the early stages of the millennials. We were Gen Y before all of you other true millennials were born.
Wait, there's a
we were
difference?
Gen Y, yeah.
What's that?
We were Gen Y, and then all of a sudden, like, the 90s hit, and everyone became a millennial. But we were Gen Y. We were the in-between.
Okay.
Right, or some people call us the lost generation. Like, if you're born 1979 to, like, 84, you're a lost generation because you're in between.
Okay.
Yeah, anyways, so for those of us who are, like, the old millennials, we're, like, some of the only homeowners, where the younger millennials, like a lot of the economists are like, you'll never be able to be a homeowner.
I was reading about that, yeah.
So what does it look like then to be in community when when the ideal that many of us were grown up with is, you're going to own your own home, you're going to have your land. In these community ideas, it's like, okay, we're going to take down the fences. But if you can't even own a home, then, or like invest in a piece of property, then what is that? So this is where a lot of
That's
younger
what,
millennials.
you think that's what's pushing people
into the
towards
co-housing.
community, and
Yeah,
that same
and
for
into
us,
community,
kind of
yeah.
really here too. It's like when you think about like someone was asking me yesterday about like, well, they're looking around the area, like why should I join this community versus this community project, development project versus going and creating just buying another piece of land out there and doing my own thing. And I was like, well, for one, like, you're going to be homesteading on your own is difficult. It's super hard. Like, you don't have, like, people to help you. You want to, when you're, like, a landowner out there on your own, first of all, you're isolated. You have to drive to go anywhere, really. If you're going to, like, for instance, we're in the middle of funding a well project. That's a serious that takes a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, to build a well by yourself could range $10,000 to $100,000 depending on how deep, where you are.
And I think ours is like on the lower end, like 30,000 or something like that. But
imagine then that's divided amongst 25 people.
We have 25 land partners, so it's a little over $1,000 per person, which is much more affordable than 20,000. So there's the financial realities. There's also
shared resources,
security. Like security. Like if someone goes out of town, for instance, like your house is sitting there empty. That's not always a good thing, So, anyways.
Yeah, and like a lot of us, might associate some of your community with family members, but sometimes you don't always feel that with family, And I've observed in a lot of the folks who move down here, like thinking about relocating, you start to find family in other people. Like that's how I feel about you, It's like, I know. Oh,
I complete you.
Oh, you complete me. But I know I can like trust 100%.
Yeah.
And takes also a lot of work, because people.
Well, 15 years of you and me fighting over things and getting over
to know
them,
each
and
other
like, it takes that.
Conflict
resolution is important. It's how you get to know people. We've
Yeah.
only had a couple small spats over the years.
But that is something, when we think about like some of the social dynamics that come up, right? Because the one, if you're going to get into community, that land management is a huge thing, right? And so we do get to share that. And land management technically is pretty easy, like to work through, to figure out like what we need to do. It's about the humans making the decisions to do it. So social dynamics come up. And what I've observed in some of the other communities I've lived in, we didn't get to those, but we can talk about them at another time maybe, but they were more condominium style, which meant...
You're talking about like
Lacovia, for example. Yeah, which had some collective ownership, but also like autonomy within your space. But what I noticed in community, what comes up the most that causes the biggest issues, 1, finances, 2, pets, 3, children.
Absolutely.
And so those are like the things that you've got to like deal with a lot of times because people are going to... Noise is another one. Yeah.
Sound.
Mm-hmm. Or it's like you're a musician, for example. And I have on either side of me in my other little ridge over there where I live about 7 minutes walking from Finca Vida Verde, is like 2 of my land neighbors, our land partners, are both musicians, and they're very sensitive to sound, right? Very sensitive. And so we talked about at one point having community chickens, neighborhood chickens, because one of them's a touring musician, one of them goes out and does gigs around Costa Rica, one actually does like international touring. And me, myself, I come in and out of the community for a few months. Like I'm mostly here, but I'll leave for a few months at a time. So it's like maintaining, if each of us had our own chicken coop, this is just an example, right? If each of us had our own chicken coop, like how do you take care of those living creatures that need
when you're not here? When you're not here 24/7.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we talked about it'd be really cool if we could have like a little neighborhood coop. But then the whole conversation, are we gonna have a rooster? No, we cannot have a rooster, right? Where like for me, I'm very accustomed to it. Like a rooster doesn't bother me. It doesn't wake me up at 4 a.m. Because I've lived with roosters for a long time, right? But like for my neighbors, they're like, absolutely no rooster, So, and then what I heard recently with one of the other communities in regards to like pets was like, okay, now your cat can't leave your yard.
Right, they want to collar the cats.
Collar the cats. Yeah. So, so it's like there's always like, and these seem like small things. But they actually can create huge issues in community settings because people have all different personal ideas, and then also it's very personal. It's like your cat.
Well,
or your
especially,
pet.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. People are so, like, attached to their pets or, like, part of their family. But, like, and, you know, every dog owner in the world is like, my dog doesn't do that. My dog doesn't. My dog doesn't. It's like, yeah, as soon as it gets around with another dog, it's like game over. Like, those dogs are doing something new, like, that you've never seen your dog do that before. It's like, so, yeah, it's a whole thing. So wait, so bringing it back, so we're my land partner in Taquatal. We've been here for 15 years. You've been here, like 8, 10, 6 now, pretty much. In the area for
8 years.
8 years.
I lived in the Caribbean
but in
for 5 years
Taquatal
straight.
for like maybe 4 solid.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and but also in La Ecovia. So what was your experience? I mean, what was the difference between La Ecovia and here? Like in a quick, like if you can like sum it, like
My biggest sum is that this community of Taquatal is much more skills-based. Skills-based, meaning...
What do you mean by that?
Earth skills-based.
Okay, yeah.
So what I noticed, the huge difference was that in Ecovia, for example, people had maybe an inkling as to what permaculture meant philosophically and almost zero experience in working with the land and working with the plants and understanding water systems and understanding soil and compost. And it was all put into hands of workers who aren't trained in permaculture at all. Right. And where here, I've noticed in Taquatal, is that people are much more earth skills based, and that like we have members who are natural builders. We have members who are, you know, you are actively, like you weren't formally trained per se, but you are on the ground with your hands on the ground like almost every day. You're out there composting, chopping, you know, tending your trees, processing your food. You know, we have people who are plumbers by trade. We have people who understand, you know, earthworks and like water work design and stuff. You know, people who understand how to cultivate plants, botanists who've studied the forest extensively. So who can go through and be like, okay, this is this native tree, this is this native tree. So I actually see that we're much more of a cohesive guild in at least like that aspect of who we are, versus the other community where it's much more philosophical.
Well, and also there's a whole another side of it too, which is what actually brought all of Taquatal together originally was music festivals and festival community. Like, you know, I mean, I met Steven at Earth Dance in Northern California, and I met him through Ilana, who is one of our other land partners who was in my band. She was a singer in my band. She brought Steven to the show. So these festivals are really like the thing that really brought us all together, and what we continue to do, like you and me doing. And we did a big events. New Year's. We did a New Year's party this year. Sarah's vended twice at our New Year's party, where I manage the stage and she does the elixir bar. And then
we brought in educational groups, you know, for 10 days to 2 weeks, you know, like, and
I host Finca Vida Verde. We host Sarah's annually. We've traditionally hosted her herbalism apprenticeship, which is just super awesome, by the way. I freaking love having all these great, sweet. The herbalists are some of the sweetest people. Like,
it's true.
It's
herbalists
so true.
Are the best. I'm not biased. We really are. Just
the Permies are cool. The yogis are awesome too. Like, to be honest, like I kind of love
top.
Everybody. So yeah. Anyway.
So, you know, looking at like how we came together, you know, was rooted in that. So I think that for just to kind of start to wrap things up for those of you and, you know, thinking about community and thinking about, you know, like, why do I want to be in community and what's it mean? It's important to have your intersections and your cohesions, but it's also really important to have that diversity in there, that people have various skill sets, because if everyone came into community, everyone say is just a soil scientist, right? We're just going to go there. Everyone's just like plays guitar in a band, right? Everyone only plays guitar. Is it really a band?
No.
It's not.
No, you need the drummer, you need the bassist, you need the keys.
Exactly.
The
So,
singer.
So that's also something you want to think about as you're bringing together community, is like what weaves us together. And I love the metaphor of a tapestry, right? The more intersections we create, the stronger the web gets in creating that fabric. So thinking about that, but also like who are all the different skill sets that people have,
right?
And how can we bring them together, because that's actually going to make the community stronger. It's the metaphor of the forest again. The metaphor of the forest is that A forest is not an orchard, right? An orchard, especially a monocrop orchard, all the apple trees is only going to provide for one aspect of the diet.
Right.
You know, where the food forest is going to provide for all different aspects of the diet as well as the overall ecosystem health.
And but I think, and to contradict that a little bit, and not to contradict it, but to add to it, really, is that there also needs to be a certain amount of overlap of like culture, like you know, like knowing there, you know, where skills maybe need to be like in that tapestry side, having some commonality, like we've been discussing, like all the commonalities. There's no. That's why you and I are some of the closest friends here. Like you are my closest friend in Talk with Tall. It's because we have so much overlap, because we have so much in common. So it's another thing to consider is like, do these people share your values? Do these people share your ideals? You know, do you want to grow your own food and eat off the land and care about your water and these things? It's super important.
Yeah, and even like language. Like I noticed one of the limiting factors too of living in Ecovia, for example, is it's so diverse with so many different countries. And the common language was English, or is English, and Spanish probably second common language. And so, but what happens there is, remember, language is culture. And so when you're only speaking, you're thinking through your native tongue, and then you're trying to speak in second or third language, sometimes there's things that get missed or mistranslated.
Right.
So that can come up too, where it just adds another layer of having to be extra patient and trying to understand what's happening. So there's so much we could talk about.
I know. I think we could keep going for freaking ever and ever and ever.
We could do part 2, 3,
We'll do
4.
part 2, 3, and 4. We'll have Sarah Wu back on the La Vida Verde podcast. Thank you, Sarah, for taking the time out to come join me. I love you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Make sure to check out Finca Vida Verde on Instagram. You can check it out on the web. Beautiful community here.
YouTube. We just started a YouTube channel. It's La Vida Verde Podcast. So you can go see more episodes on there. And yes, our Instagram is finca_vida_verde. And
I'm
Sarah Wu.
Your friendly village witch. You can also find me on villagewitch.org or sarahwu.villagewitch.original because I have copycats out there.
Bastards. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Love you. See you soon. Muchas gracias. Ciao, everybody. Till the next time. Pura vida.